Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's event addressing greening raw materials policy. Before we kick off today's discussion, I would like to take the opportunity to thank MEP Ms. Asimakopoulou for hosting this event under the umbrella of the European Parliament Intergroup. Ms. Asimakopoulou is an MEP for the group of the European People's Party and significantly the Vice Chair of the Committee on International Trade, INTA, but also the inter alia shadow rapporteur for the opinion on the European Strategy for Critical Raw Materials. Just prior to passing the floor to Ms. Asimakopoulou for her opening remarks, I would like to invite participants to also send us their questions during the event. For that, you can use the Q&As box of the platform, choosing the All Panelists option. Within your question as well, please make sure to indicate the speaker to whom your question is best addressed, so that on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, we can facilitate a fruitful discussion to follow. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today. And Ms. Asimakopoulou, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be hosting this event today and to be amongst so many distinguished participants and fellow panelists. I'll start by getting right to the point. The green and digital transition rests on our ability to access key critical materials, period. Electric vehicles, batteries, semiconductors, solar panels, wind turbines, you name it. Raw materials are the indispensable building blocks of the green economy. For too many of these raw materials, however, our reliance on China and on other regions leaves us beholden to single and limited supply chains, often imposing products with higher carbon footprints and of questionable due diligence. Now, none of this is particularly new. The EU's first critical raw materials initiative dates back to 2008, as you know, with the first priority list published in 2011. Fast forward a decade, and we're now on our fourth list, which has doubled in size, but we still face many of the same problems, often at a much bigger disadvantage than when we started, which is quite sad. The current pressures on supply chains that we're experiencing is a fresh reminder for us of how quickly and pressing the situation can be. And I'm going to give you the example of magnesium. It's a perfect case in point. Here, China controls around 87% of world production. We in the European Union rely on it for 95% of our supplies. And right now, decisions in China to cut production are leaving European industry with huge price spikes and a coming shortage. So I've tabled a question along with colleagues to the Commission on this, but it demonstrates why it's not sustainable for us to rely on one supplier. We can't continue to go down this route. So really the question is, how many reminders of this do we need? We shouldn't have forgotten, for example, that China actually decided to cut its export quota for rare earths by 40% back in 2010 as part of its own strategy. So now we've seen some diversification since then, but still, today China is responsible for 55% of global production and 85% of refining output when it comes to rare earths. Now, I've been a vocal supporter, as you know, of IRMA and of EIT raw materials, which they're doing a great job. EIT raw materials last month published a paper on the importance of rare earths to the electronic vehicles industry, with a particular focus on the role of the rare earth permanent magnets, which are key to their production. We have some good recommendations to achieve a more sustainable, a greener supply chain here. And basically recommendations to follow the good example of the battery regulation by launching a study on what the key factors are to determine the production of sustainable rare earth magnets. So what I think and would like to put to you is that we absolutely need to look at broadening the eligibility criteria for the EU Innovation Fund, which is currently only accessible to projects that support the supply chain of renewable energy generation. Expanding this to include the electric vehicle supply chain, I think would be a very big step in the right direction. This could help us fund projects like the rare earth separation facility that operates in Estonia, for example, which is the only one of its kind in the EU. So we need to support our domestic supply sources where we can. they're the best route we have to providing us with more secure and more sustainable resource. But they also have the chance to help us develop our own value chains. I understand clearly that this kind of reshoring has limits. And that's why we also need to invest heavily in our recycling facilities and to focus on improving the circular economy. I know this is at the heart of your discussions today. We'll hear from CEPI shortly, which represents the European paper industry. Here we have a very good example that we can all learn from. It's made huge strides in this area. Europe has the highest recycling rate for paper in the world at nearly 75%. We'll also hear from Ulrich, who works across the board on recycling initiatives in Europe. As you know, aluminium is an area where I focus a lot, and I know that Ulrich also works to promote the benefits of recycling here. Aluminium is a highly recyclable material, and for an industry that's incredibly energy intensive, it's not surprising that the recycling of aluminium can save up to 92% in CO2 emissions when compared to its primary production. Another incredibly important material for the manufacture of electric vehicles is aluminium, and that way it should be added. It's not itself a raw material, but bauxite is, which is a primary source. And as I said before, magnesium also is interlinked with the industry. So we need to be particularly vigilant in what's going on with magnesium as well. Now, I come to CBAM, under which aluminium will be covered. This is a very important file for us to watch. The proposal is primarily aimed at trying to reduce carbon leakage, so we need to take seriously the concerns that we hear coming from industry about its ability to achieve this objective. I note that in the Commission's own impact assessment, it talks of a risk of up to 80% in resource shuffling in the case of aluminium, which hints that some of the knock-on effects of encouraging third countries to decarbonize are probably overly optimistic. This is very important, especially when we consider that primary production in Europe is 3 times less carbon intensive than primary production in China, where over 80% of production is reliant on coal-fired power generation. Now, another file we need to pay attention to is the batteries regulation. This should be adopted by ENVI, I think, early next year. This is a very wide-ranging file, primarily rooted in trying to improve due diligence in the supply chain and ensure ethical sourcing. There's also a big focus on recycling and limiting environmental damage through battery life cycles. We will see new targets set for recycling rates and a greater focus on repurposing. Good progress here. Clearly, the more secondary raw materials that we can keep in Europe and reuse, the less we will be reliant on external lines of supply. These give some clear examples of how we're legislating to better green our raw materials. But I would like to close this introductory intervention with a broader political point. For some, there is an unwillingness to accept the interconnectedness of raw materials and the transition to a greener economy. For some, raw materials equals mining and carbon-intensive industry, and they just prefer to ignore this. They only want to talk about the positive side of the electric vehicle revolution and the benefits of renewable energy resources. Well, that's great, but as I said in the beginning, you can't have one without the other. Raw materials are the indispensable building blocks of the green economy. So reshoring, nearshoring, recycling, and supply chain diversification. This is the formula in a nutshell for EU resilience. So thank you very much for being here today. It's a pleasure to host this event. I look forward to hearing the interventions of my fellow panelists and summing up their conclusions and having a fruitful and productive discussion in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Asimakopoulou, for setting the scene with regards to today's webinar, underlining the key importance, but also the timely nature of our discussions. Moving ahead in the agenda of today's event, I would just like to inform our audience that earlier this morning we were made aware that due to unforeseen circumstances, unfortunately, Ms. Ail, Deputy Head of B3 Unit on Waste Management and Secondary Raw Materials within DG Environment, will not be able to participate to today's event. At the same time, due to the short notice, unfortunately, conditions would not allow for a replacement. So we'll be proceeding without the participation of Ms. Ail. But at the same time, I'm very happy, as indeed as mentioned by Ms. Asimakopoulou earlier in her intervention, we're accompanied by an excellent set of speakers. So please allow me to take the opportunity to present them. We have together with us Mr. Emmanuel Katrakis. Mr. Katrakis is the Secretary General of the European Recycling Industries Confederation and works on the development of the Confederation and its efficient organization to act as the interface between the recycling industry and the European institutions. Good morning, Emmanuel. We also have with us Mr. Stefan Arditi, Director of Policy Integration and Circular Economy at the European Environmental Bureau. Mr. Arditi is in charge of the definition and implementation of European public policy on low carbon and circular economy. Hello, Stefan. Mr. Ulrich Leberl has also been working for CEPI, the European Association for representing the paper industry, for 15 years now, currently holding the position of Raw Materials Director. Hello, Ulrich. And of course, Mr. Paul Skihan, last but not least, representing Food Drink Europe today. He's working for PepsiCo as Senior Director for EU Public Policy, Government Affairs and Communications. And prior to that, he also worked as the Director General for the Brussels-based Association of Spirits Europe. At the same time, later in the course of the event, we will welcome the interventions of MEP Mr. Cyrus Engerer and Ms. Manuela Ripa. Mr. Engerer is a member of the European Parliament for the group of the Socialists and Democrats since 2020, and inter alia a member of the Committee on Environment, Public Health and Food Safety within the European Parliament. And of course, Ms. Manuela Ripa is an MEP for the group of Greens, and in her role as member of the ITRE committee, of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and substitute for INTA committee. She has worked as a shadow rapporteur on the opinion of the European Strategy for Critical Raw Materials, as well as the opinion on the proposal for a regulation concerning batteries and waste batteries. So we'll be hearing more from the MEPs later in the course of the event. But just as we're about to kickstart the panel discussion, I would like to ask our panelists what greening raw materials policy means for your organization. So maybe we can start with Emmanuel.
Yes, good morning, everyone. I also would like to very warmly thank Mrs. Asimakopoulou for hosting this event, and obviously the BCD for facilitating its organization. I just want to start. I sent just one slide to Regine. I don't know, Regine Oncochi, I don't know whether you can show it, but just echoing what Mrs. Asimakopoulou said. Raw materials are key to the green transition. And the recycling industry is an industry that basically creates jobs locally, produce out of waste raw materials to put them back into the economy. Now, the circular economy today, I think everybody agrees, is a must, not only for the geostrategic reasons that has been highlighted in the introduction made by Mrs. Asimakopoulou, but also because we have to live within the boundaries of one planet. So it's absolutely essential, basically, to be able to be more sustainable when it comes to raw material uses. I want to kickstart with only one number. Today, only 12% of the raw materials that are being used by the European industry comes from recycling. So it means that more or less nearly 90% come from virgin raw materials or extracted raw materials. Most of them are being basically imported, and that has been rightly mentioned. That's the reason why we have a high degree of exposure. And on the other hand, over the last 40 years, with the waste legislation, and I think that's why it's very sad that the European Commission cannot be participating, the recycling industry has been doing very important progress towards basically recovering from waste a wide variety of materials. So now just to get back to the questions, because I know we only have 2 minutes, what does it mean to green our raw materials policy from a recycler's perspective? First, it means to work on product design. Products are absolutely key. 80% of the impacts of a product is determined at its design stage. And while it has been said as well, recycling aluminium is pretty straightforward. There is in product design a lot of untapped potential to make sure that we don't only design products to make sure they fulfill their basically their function, but that also throughout the life cycle, they can basically be more reusable, more recyclable, and also at the same time use more recycled material. That comes to point number 2. And this is one of the reasons why today we are still lagging behind when it comes to scale up recycling capacity in Europe. We have had a lot of push measures, recycling target that has been said, for instance, for paper, measures that focus on proper separate collection, that has to be better implemented, but they are there for quite some time, recycling targets, but not many measures to pull the demand for recycled materials back into product. And here there is no one-size-fits-all solution, but what we saw in the field of packaging is that setting targets for recycled content, here for only one type of polymer, has had extremely positive impacts on the circular value chain because it created a demand. It decorrelated basically the price of recycled materials from oil prices. Today they're extremely high, but when they are low, it's extremely difficult to compete. And they internalize something that was never made in market prices, the benefits of recycling in terms of energy and CO2 savings. So recycled content targets have proved to be very efficient. We can also think about market and fiscal-based incentives because, and it has also been said, when you want to go for hard to recycle type of products, be it electronic waste, be it cars, and especially we see there are a lot of evolutions in car design, we need obviously to make sure that we build the capacity and that we are competitive. And obviously to be competitive, we need as well to make sure that those environmental benefits we produce are going to be rewarded in market prices so we can compete. And that's the second point that is absolutely crucial. And I think here there is an interesting link between, on one hand, the circular economy policies and the climate policy, because pricing carbon is a powerful tool to make sure that those environmental externalities are better priced. So I understand we need to avoid overshooting and make sure that our industry is competitive, but at the same time, we shall not try to slow down that transition. So here there is a balance to be found. And point number 3, and I think that's absolutely essential as well, we need a much better function of the internal market for recycling. And over the last really 50 years, we saw it worked for goods. We still do not have harmonized status for recovered materials or recycled materials or raw materials from recycling that are meeting quality standards. So we need to make sure that we are going to have a much better harmonized status for paper, for tires, for rubber, for different types of materials when it comes to their status, when they are meeting those quality specifications that make them substitutable in production processes. And at the same time, we need to protect free and fair trade of secondary raw materials, because for a number of raw materials, we have more supply than demand in Europe, and we shall not put barriers. We shall actually try to make sure that we are using more raw materials in Europe for raw materials from recycling back into production processes, but we shall not put trade restrictions that are going to impact the competitiveness of the recycling industry. And just nearby, I've put a number from different sources of CO2 energy savings for different types of materials which have been recycled and which are being used as a substitute to extracted raw materials in production processes. So I stop here, and as a little introduction.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your remarks. Now turning to Mr. Arditi on behalf of the EB, the European Environmental Bureau. Stefan, from your point of view, what would greening raw materials policy mean for EEB?
Hello, everyone. Great thanks to Ms. Asimakopoulou and the EBCD for organizing this event and inviting the EB. I'll be quite short and keep some details discussion on policy measure for the next stage of the discussion. But I would like to say that there is a bit of worry from our organization when we speak about greening raw materials. And the first thing that comes to our mind is, can we not replace this greening wording by responsible mining, responsible extraction, then recognizing that there is always a consequence to extracting a new material, being biotic resources or abiotic resources. And under this kind of responsibility wording, what we cover is, of course, to try to respect some of the sustainable criteria, including, the right of local community to be involved as early as possible in any new mining or extraction process, including for forestry extraction. But it's also trying to act within the planet boundary, taking our responsibility not to exceed the planet boundary, because this is not something that we can then ask the other I would say, comply with if ourselves we are not compliant with those planet boundaries. And finally, as an introduction, I'd like also to include in this responsible mining extraction something that Ms. Asimakopoulou rightly mentioned. This is the consistency of our policy, notably when it comes to climate policy. I mean, of course, we have to act to reduce our climate impact, but we have, as she rightly mentioned, be aware of the consequence in terms of material demand this would require. And that means that being responsible means being brave enough to question our needs and our current consumption of resources, rather than say, well, we need to produce more digital gadgets, we need to produce more renewable energy, so let's be blind on the consequence of mining the material to achieve this. So 3 things: responsible mining, be acting within planet boundaries, and being consistent and not blind when we set some high-level commitment. That means being brave enough to question our current consumption patterns. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for underlining the importance of consistency, responsible mining extraction, but also the respect to planetary boundaries. I trust that all those points will be angles that we'll be addressing shortly as well. But before that, Ulrich, welcome to the discussion. I would just like to give you the floor for your remarks as well with regards to what greening raw materials policy means for CEPI.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel. Thank you very much, MEP Asimakopoulou, for involving CEPI. I have sent also one slide earlier this morning to Regina, and it would be great if we can show it. It is to illustrate a little bit where the European paper industry is with respect to raw materials. And I think greening a raw materials policy is indeed not only connected to raw materials as such, but also has wider implications throughout all the life cycle of products, because indeed a green raw material starts with the consumption and with the design of products that necessitate then certain raw materials. So if you have wrong product design or wrong consumption patterns, it is very difficult to solve it then through the raw materials that are needed there. But I think paper industry has also been invited because we have been seeing quite a evolution in this sector, and there may be some learnings, of course, but maybe, of course, not every sector is similar. But on the left, you see here what the shares of the different raw materials are for paper making in Europe, keeping in mind that we are an industry that is exporting. So we are producing more paper and board for packaging, etc. Then we import from other areas of the world. So that is, of course, a strong factor for European resilience, and that has led, of course, to a very long European value chain, because if you look at the left, we have these natural cycles. So these are wood from European forests. So really the job creation starts with the forest owners and managers in Europe, goes through machine suppliers and paper manufacturing in Europe, and continues afterwards through the residues that we are using from other European industries. And also the recycling takes place in Europe, creating a lot of value and jobs in the local areas, not only in the rural areas where the forests are, but also in the cities where the products are disposed of and recycled again to their new life cycle. So 2/3 are actually part of this circular economy, with 56% is paper that all the citizens and commerces, etc., collect and that are then collected, that are sorted and coming back for paper production. Then the 11% there, that is residues that we are using actually from other industries that are then recycled in the paper industry. When we think of, for example, the wood industry that has residues that can be recycled into paper. And then 22% are the silvicultural measures that the forest that allow an income to the forest owner, because only every third generation there is really a final harvest, and that is those 11%. So we have a strong green raw material component in our industry, and on top of that, of course, the residues from these production processes help us having a high share of renewable energy. So almost 2/3 of our energy needs are based on renewable energy. What we really can observe is that connected to some of the issues that were raised by Stefan and Emmanuel, is on a lot is discussed about mandatory recycled contents, and indeed we need to look at different materials. For us, we see that there is a strong demand for recycled content by the customers. So there is a healthy demand for paper for recycling by the European paper industry, but then also beyond at the global level. So the bottleneck is really still in making sure we have better collection systems and really more harmonized separate collection system, paper and board separately from other recyclables and from residual waste. That is the bottleneck for having more potential. But then to really improve the resilience of European industry, I think it is really important also to define secondary raw materials in a consistent way between the moment they are recovered from the waste streams, where waste legislation, and indeed it's a pity Commission is not there, because we have the waste shipments regulation coming. So where there is a lot of restrictions that could be still improved, and we hope that this revision will help that. And the moment they are really recycled into the new products serving our industry, and that status needs to be better defined. We need to move to renewable raw materials instead of CO2 intensive raw materials, obviously where that is possible. Of course, it's not everywhere possible today. Recyclable materials instead of non-recyclable ones, to really close the loop, and moving to materials substituting non-recyclable materials with recyclable materials, because there we see really that potential to green then not only the policy, but really greening the raw material consumption for the sustainable consumption patterns that we want to achieve in Europe. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ulrich, for your remarks and for the stats provided as well. Now, last but not least, Mr. Skehan, of course, the food industry has equally a great potential in contributing to greening raw materials policy, but What would that entail? What does that mean? What greening raw materials policy mean for your organization?
Elias, good morning. Thank you very much. Yeah, I think there's great possibilities in the food and beverage sector. There's great responsibility in that sector. It's an enormous sector within Europe. It's about a 1.3 trillion euro business. It's about 290,000 companies, most of them, the vast majority, 99% SMEs, and it employs about 4.8 million people. So a colossal sector with its fingers back into the agriculture sector and right through distribution, retail, and to the consumer. So we understand the responsibility our sector has. We also understand the scale and scope and the power of the sector in terms of trying to influence change. It's an interesting question, what's meant by greening raw materials? And for me, I kind of step out of it a little bit and get to a bigger picture and then come back into it, if you don't mind. I think everything starts, or at least it should end, with net zero by 2050 or earlier. And I think that is the starting point for the discussion, at least in my mind. And for the food and beverage sector, if we look at that target, and we support that target, so Food Drink Europe is clearly in favor of it, it's come out publicly. If we were to achieve that target by that date or earlier, as I say, we look at all of the different ways in which our sector has an impact on climate, on the environment, on sustainability. And in essence, we have to look at what we grow, how we make, how we distribute and transport, how our products are consumed, and what happens to the waste, packaging, waste food afterwards. And I think, you know, all of those different areas have different actions, different consequences, different scales, and we have more control over certain of those aspects than others, clearly. But it's right along that range that we look at. If within PepsiCo, if we do that and we look at our footprint, if you like, we can see that our footprint is dominated by agricultural supply chain. So if we look at our suppliers in the farmers who provide our potatoes and milk and oats and grain and so on, that is an enormous part of the footprint. That on its own is roughly equivalent to our packaging and our transport footprints together. And between them, the three of those account for about 80% of our footprint. So, and if you think of the raw materials that are inherent in those three different aspects, those raw materials coming from the farms, clearly, the raw materials that go into packaging, and the raw materials, the fuels and the energies that go into distribution and transport, that is a colossal sum of raw material over which we need to try to influence and which we need to try to manage in clever ways. And I think it's different in each of the cases, in fact. And so for me, greening raw materials comes down to, on the agricultural side, making sure that the practices that are in place in the farming communities with our partners there are regenerative. So whatever is happening is regenerating the ground, it's replacing water, it's replacing what's needed, the nutrients in the soil. I think in our own plants, we need to look at the fuels we use, the energy we use. It needs to be renewable. The same with regard to the transport and distribution sectors that we use to get our products to the market. And then I think on the packaging side, it needs to be recycled. And I think, you know, here, in fact, I'd go even further, I think, than Ulrich. You know, he talks about the need for everything to be renewable. I agree with that, and we have targets towards that. But renewable is a step towards actually renewed. And so I think we need to be, recycled versus recyclable. I think recyclable is great, but recycled will be the nirvana. That's where we need to get to. So that for me is where we are aiming for. And I'm happy to outline and expand on some of those later in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for your remarks. And on this note, I would just like to take the opportunity to remind our audience for the day that we're also equally very much looking forward on hearing from you as well. So for that, please feel free to send us your questions during the Q&As box of the platform. And turning to Emmanuel then. Emmanuel, what do you think would be the most efficient way to support the use of raw materials from recycling in order to green raw materials policy as a whole?
You know, I think if I just make a very small recap of what has been said by various speakers, there is no one-size-fits-all solution. because materials are different, because the member states are different. And this is also where I think we all agree we need to basically improve and better implement separate collection across member states, acknowledging that there are a lot of differences. But at the same time, we need to get a bit out of the kind of chicken and the egg dilemma. Just explaining myself, as said, we have had a lot of measures to set recycling targets or to set separate collections. But up until now, we are barely focusing on the use phase of those recycled material, hoping that the market is basically going to function. And we saw that for easily recyclable type of material, when the economics are there, it's being done. But for the ones which are far more difficult, or when the market conditions deteriorate, then it's not done. Simply because when you want to build an industrial capacity, you must have foreseeability. And this is why, as Europe, we have been extremely vocal and will continue in making sure that we are not only having more targets for recycling, but at the same time having more targets to use recycled materials back into products. And to do that, I think, as I said, we need three things. We need first to remove a number of bottlenecks and have a real internal market for secondary raw materials. And that means something I think on which we agree, have a proper status for the raw materials that come from recycling in legislation. So then we can also better advocate for those raw materials that have a much greener carbon and resource footprint. And at the same time, we need to not only consider, but set recycled content target, but also measures when those recycled content markets might not be the best solutions to incentivize their use and scale up industrial capacities which are using circular materials. And at the same time, while we are doing that at European level, we absolutely need to safeguard access to international markets, because here, taking the example of paper, there is, and I took the statistics that CEPI is publishing every year, and which are very good statistics. And what we see is that we have, out of what we collect in Europe and what we use in European paper mills, a gap in terms of demand of between 7 to 10 million tons. Correct me if the latest statistics show different numbers, but the ones from 2020 shows this type of gap between 7 to 10 million tons over the last 10 years, more or less. So it means that by supplying the European paper industry, which is also exporting paper produced in Europe outside Europe, we as an industry, we still need to have access to international markets. And that's the same for steel, that's the same for aluminium as well. So here it's absolutely essential to make sure that we are not putting trade restriction where we don't need to put trade restriction. And this is why we need to make a clear distinction between, on one hand, unprocessed electronics, unprocessed e-waste, unprocessed end-of-life tires, or unprocessed mixed municipal solid waste, which need to be treated in Europe, which do not need to be exported outside Europe in regions of the world where there is not proper treatment facilities, or where they are not. And here I especially have the e-waste at the back of my mind, but there are also other streams, but not put export restrictions on the fractions, those raw materials that have been recovered and which are competed on commodity markets, which are basically global commodity markets. So I think here incentivizing is the key word, and incentivizing the entire value chain, not only recycling, but also the use phase. And this is why I think we need to look at on a stream-by-stream basis and put not only those targets for recycling and targets for separate collection, but also targets to use and incentives to use more recycled materials, to move out of the fact that today we still have mostly a linear value chain where we are looking at raw material uses. And I think what Stéphane said about, for instance, responsible mining, and also looking at how much we need is also part of the picture. I think, especially while looking at net zero by 2050, I think we also need to look at our consumption patterns as a whole. But just not to try to say too many things at once and take too much time.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. And of course, I will provide the opportunity to Ulrich to also respond to your comment. But just prior to that, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Stéphane Arditi. Stéphane, Are you with us?
Yes, I am.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to ask you, following up on the discussion so far, what do you think could be a more compelling EU policy framework for extraction and use of raw materials aligned with decarbonization and meeting our circular economy goals?
Well, thank you for the question, Elias. First, I'd like to start with asking the Parliament to continue pushing for some of the good provision and formulation they've suggested in the past. First, starting with a science-based resource use material footprint reduction target. I mean, we know that if today we can be so ambitious on climate is because we had this climate target. Without such a target, we would not have had all the efforts and all the media attention we have now. So I think this is absolutely essential that we've got a material footprint reduction target as the European Parliament has called for, and considering eco-design and consumer empowerment, right to repair initiatives, also supported by the European Parliament as essential leverage to meet such a target. Another thing that the European Parliament has rightly supported is the due diligence being made more mandatory in line with this responsible mining I called for earlier on. And this should go beyond tier one, because we have to understand that tier one supplier, if they are not extracting industry, will be completely neglected if we stop to tier one due diligence. So we need to have a due diligence that goes as far as mining and extraction. Then there are things like, a clear moratorium on deep sea mining, and even being a step further, having the courage to say, in some area, we need to ban mining. And I just want to say that in Salvador in 2017, due to pollution release, they also implemented a ban on mining. So we could consider that certain, for example, Natura 2000 in EU area, but also elsewhere in the world area where protection of biodiversity is of fundamental importance, there should be no mining activities. Another things I think which is also very important and has been also, I think, supported by the European Parliament is given more right to local community. And when we say this, we say it must be beyond, I would say, some type of instrumental consultation that sometimes happen when, in fact, the solution have been pre-cooked by the authority, being at local, national, or even EU level different. We said the local authority to adopt and enforce the right of local community to allow for effective and inclusive participation in permitting procedure. And from the very early stage of the discussion, because too often they join the discussion at too late a stage when everything is in fact already decided and where I would say the local community can only be frustrated. But beyond this kind of more regulatory orientation, I think we also need to consider taxation regime. For example, in the OECD modeling, to try to mitigate the risk of supply shortage, they immediately apply a higher taxation on virgin raw material and some form of lighter taxation on recycled material. And we're going to come to this discussion about stabilizing a market for recycling. But I think this is very important that we do not neglect this taxation instrument. And also sometimes remove unfair practices or harmful subsidies to some of these extracting activity, which of course create a distortion of competition with other prevention, reuse, and recycling solutions. And I'd like to finish to answer this first question with this example. You know that rubber has been put on the list of critical raw material, and this is the only biotic material included in this latest critical raw material list. And I like this example because it looks like most of the rubber we were supplying in the past came from Thailand. But now we've developed some form of agroforestry effort along the regenerative agriculture mentioned by the Pepsi stakeholder. And I think it clearly shows that there is no contradiction between being a critical raw material and being sourced responsibly. And I think this is important, and this is something we could try to apply also for other type of critical raw materials. And maybe the EU should push and make sure that EU environmental standards are included in international agreement in sourcing and processing other type of critical material, as we have experienced with rubber. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And Ulrich, the floor is yours. I just wanted to feel free, of course, to touch upon Emmanuel's comments as well. But I wanted to already ask you, from CEPI's point of view, what are the green credentials of the paper industry's raw materials? What do you do to improve, and what do you expect from a greener raw materials policy?
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to come back on a couple of points that have been raised, and in the context of this question as well, concerning then what does that mean in terms of policy. So I think Paul mentioned the chicken and egg question as well, and stating indeed recyclable is not enough. We need to make sure products are also recycled, and so that is absolutely true. It is a cycle, and recyclable is the first condition to be recycled in the end. Because if a product is not recyclable, it doesn't make sense to collect it separately. It doesn't make sense to put it through a sorting line, because it will not be recycled anyway. So on the other hand, it makes no sense also to have very recyclable materials on everywhere if afterwards there is not the necessary infrastructure to get them sorted so that they can be recycled again and incorporated into our products. So I think there the solution really must be that we address these issues at the same time, because otherwise we will always have an excuse of not doing so. So in paper, that is really at the beginning of the life cycle. The recyclability is about the technical recyclability. So really to have the loop as close as possible, which means that they can be used for new paper products again. So not going to other also material uses, or even worse, energy uses, but really that they stay in the paper loop. Fibers have that advantage, of course, that they can be mixed with other fibers. So graphic white fibers, brown fibers, long, short fibers, they can be mixed together to have new paper products. I know it's more tricky for plastics, where you have the different polymers and others. But so it's the preconditions. But at the same time, we also need to make sure the collection systems and the sorting lines are developed along the same philosophy that we want to get back. And we have established that target to have 90% of paper-based packaging recycled in 2030. And so we really work on those 4 areas. But recyclability is where really the product design can work. And we, as a paper industry, we can make our efforts to increase the utilization rate that Emmanuel says. We need the demand, so that also on their side, the investments into the sorting lines can be done, so that they can be sure there is demand for that. So to also tell about, to make that clear, we are not calling for any export restrictions from the paper industry side. We are a net exporter as well, also on global markets. And we are but this gap that has been described, it has shrinked in the recent years a lot for 2 reasons. First of all, China has suddenly implemented a new policy of being more self-sufficient. So that reduced demand there, leading demand to other areas in Southeast Asia. And then also Brexit, of course, is almost halving that gap, because a lot of this European net export of paper for recycling was actually UK export. And if you look only at EU 27, we are in quite a balance. But indeed, we need to make sure we have a strong internal market, but that does not mean having export restrictions. We just need to make sure that the environmental conditions are equivalent also when the materials get exported, and that they are recycled in the same conditions. Yeah, on recycled content mandatory, I talked in my statement. So, but that leads me to greening policy, or greening raw material policy. We believe that it's really around the waste shipments regulation revision, so that we have a stronger internal market to really have a legal definition on secondary raw materials that we don't have today, that we have a substitution towards renewable and recycled materials indeed, and recognize also this CO2 savings through substituting materials. As paper, I will not comment on what's needed on critical raw materials. We have been in our phase, it's about the sustainability. So the virgin raw materials need to be coming from forests that are regenerated to provide the same ecosystem services, and one of them are CO2 low products for the society in the future as well. So that the criticality for us lies in efficiency, so that we use our forests in a way they are kept, and that we direct their output into a cascade, so that the same resource can be used several times and doesn't go directly to energy.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. And speaking of secondary raw materials as well, Paul, we briefly touched upon the fact that the food industry has actually a great potential in contributing to greening raw materials policy, an example by using more secondary raw materials. But talking of that, is there perhaps any best practice? And what would you see as the required market and regulatory unlocks when it comes to food packaging, for instance?
Yeah, thank you very much. I can build on Ulrich's points that he made there. I think he makes very good points about recyclable versus recycled. And I think there are responsibilities that an individual company has that are not shared. And so for me, it is the responsibility of PepsiCo to make sure that our packaging is recyclable, compostable, biodegradable, or whatever, by a certain date. And we have that. So we're currently at about 90% of that, where our ambition is to be 100% by 2025. And there are still bits of color that we have in certain bottles that have been part of the branding forever, which we're transitioning out of, which make recycling difficult. There are shrink sleeves that we're getting rid of. There's all sorts of bits that we still have to fine tune. But by 2025, everything recyclable. That's our responsibility. And then I think we have a shared responsibility to convert that recyclable title into recycled. And that's a shared responsibility across the sector as a whole, beyond that to all of the producers who are putting packaging into the market. And it's also shared with the legislators. It's shared with consumers, because for a system to be truly circular, everyone has to play a part. And I think there are good practices currently that we can look at, and there are big gaps that we can look at. So if you imagine, again, the food and beverage sector, Food Drink Europe, PepsiCo, we use every single type of packaging you can imagine. So our products, paper, alu, glass, plastic, everything is in there. It's totally uneven in terms of how much of that gets recycled or not. And even if you just zero in on plastics, that's also totally uneven. So I think a good practice, if you look at it over the last number of years, has been the evolution of the recycled PET market. So PET is the hard plastic you find in bottles. That as a market is developing nicely through extended producer responsibility schemes, EPR schemes that are throughout the EU at this stage, to which we pay. Lots of rPET is collected. If it's not being collected there, we're setting up deposit return schemes and supporting them, funding them, and they're collecting more. So rPET is now being collected. It's being sorted by the consumer at home and put into the blue bin or brought back to the retailer through the DRS machine. It's going into the recycling plant. It's going into the sorting, first of all. It's pretty much sorted as it is. It gets sorted out, it goes to the recyclers. It's good quality material. They use it, they recycle it. We can reuse it in bottles. And so for PepsiCo, it is possible for us to say by the end of next year, our Pepsi brand in 11 different markets will be 100% rPET. So that's something that we can say, we kind of aspire to, we can then try and plan for. But there are difficulties with that. That's on the rPET side, and there are difficulties there, trust me. But on the flex packaging side, so if you imagine crisp bags, there none of that same infrastructure is in place. And so flex packaging is something that's typically not collected by the separation that we do at home. So here in Belgium, for instance, it's only this year that I can put flex bags into the blue bag that then it's kind of pre-sorted before it goes. That's the same as in Germany, Netherlands, but in most other European countries, those bags are not sorted at home, nor is there any sort of return scheme to bring them back to retailers. And so most of those bags will end up in incineration or landfill. So I think there are gaps there, and I think there are interesting practices coming to try and help solve some of those problems. So for instance, with regard to sorting, there is one of the problems I think there exists is a kind of lack of harmonized sorting instructions for consumers throughout Europe. There are some really interesting examples in Denmark of sorting instructions that are numeric and visual rather than by word. And I think those could be easily implemented across Europe and helping consumers make good choices in terms of how they do the triage. I think there's interesting pilot that we're involved in called Holy Grail, which is a kind of invisible watermark that can be printed onto all packaging. In fact, not just onto the sleeve of the packaging, but actually into the plastic or into the product itself. And that would allow much more efficient sorting in the sorting plant so that the right materials are going to the right recyclers and so on. But I think there are really interesting practices like that. On a sectoral level, I'd have to point as well, Food in Europe have done a great job earlier this year in bringing out a decarbonization roadmap. Because while for PepsiCo and other bigger companies, you know, we have a certain clout, we have a certain scale, we can do things. If you think of the 99% that are SMEs, they don't have that same clout. And so they need support, they need help. And I think then associations like Food in Europe can play a big part. And I'm happy to come back to some of the unlocks maybe later, because I think there are many unlocks that are needed. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you very much to all of our speakers of this panel discussion for your input, allowing for a fruitful and very interactive discussion. I do have a final round of questions, just looking at the time though and our agenda of the day. Perhaps we can touch upon those during the Q&A session later on, because for the time being, I would like to provide the floor to honorable members of the European Parliament as well, Mr. Engerer and Ms. Manuela Ripa, for their reaction. So perhaps we can start with Mr. Engerer. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you, Elias, and good morning, everyone. And thank you, obviously, to the European Bureau for Conservation and Development, as well as the Secretariat of our intergroup within the European Parliament for Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development, for organizing this very valuable discussion today with all these very interesting panelists who have joined us to share their insight on Europe's transition towards a more circular economy. It is clear that if we are serious about achieving the environmental and climate goals in the EU Green Deal, and to make Europe the first net zero greenhouse gas emission continent, we need to move away from the methods that we have employed so far to sustain our economies. Currently, we are consuming almost about 3 times more resources than what our planet is able to generate on a yearly basis. And we need to move away from this and towards a situation where economic growth is generated without the constant exploitation of natural resources. Parliament's priorities with regard to our vision for a future based on a circular economy for our citizens came out clearly in the report we adopted earlier this year. The significant reduction in our overall use of natural resources and in our waste production should be the overarching objective of the circular economy. And this overarching objective is reflected in Parliament's call for more ambition than what we saw in the Commission's Circular Economy Action Plan. Specifically, with regards to the need for specific and binding targets for the reducing the use of raw materials and for reducing the impact of consumption on the environment. And to move towards this decoupling of economic growth from resource exploitation, we need greater focus on greener standards and more circularity with regard to this design and production of products. 80% of the product's environmental impact is determined at the design phase, and therefore we need product-specific targets on recycled content. Such a greater focus on design and production aspects of circularity and ensuring equivalence in the quality of a recycled product, however, needs major investments and innovation and new technologies. And this is something which the Commission and Member States need to start catering for and planning for. A circular economy will also require an enhanced waste policy and implementation. And if we are to meet our recycling targets by 2035, we definitely need to move faster towards more sustainable alternative waste management technologies where this is possible. In this regard, the Commission should strengthen its efforts to promote the sharing of best practices in waste collection and new sorting infrastructure. In this regard, it is also essential, I believe, to see real ambition in the upcoming revision of the waste shipment regulation in order to tackle the export of waste to third countries, which is not meeting EU treatment standards and is leading to environmental harm and harm to human health at the end of the day. Financial incentives need to stop such export of waste, and we should seriously be considered the Commission should seriously consider its proposals to move in this area. So I'm really sorry that the Commission wasn't able to be here with us today. However, we're also making that point very clear and strongly in the ENVI committee in the European Parliament. A system needs to be in place to better monitor waste flows, such as through public access to waste trade data, which is also very essential in this regard. Also, while we are seeing that the willingness for the transition to a circular economy is there on the part of companies and other industry players, there are quite a number of legislative and administrative obstacles which need to be overcome before we can get there. We need legislative proposals on the environment and carbon footprint of the EU's production and consumption, such as on sustainable products, for instance, and measures addressing product design. In this regard, we should recognize the potential for action in the recovery process from the COVID-19 pandemic. During the past 2 years, the fragility of our resources and value chains has quickly been exposed, but the momentum to address obstacles to our green ambition through our recovery process has been built and can be used to address those hurdles which have been hindering our success path to a truly circular approach. And at the same time, we are aware of the opportunities presented by the circular economy for job generation, with 700,000 new jobs which can be created by 2030, making circularity a key contributor to our economic recovery process. It is therefore clear that a circular approach is our path towards a greener and more prosperous future, and that the way forward is recognizing that economic growth and a circular approach go hand in hand rather than hinder each other. and that is what we need to be striving for. Thank you for this very interesting discussion, and I look forward to continuing discussing with you in more detail.
Thank you very much, Mr. Engerer, for your remarks, specifically highlighting some key policy opportunities ahead, but also some solutions with regards to some legislative challenges, as mentioned during your intervention. So now I would like to turn to Ms. MEP, Ms. Manuela Ripa, for her reaction as well. Ms. Ripa has worked as a shadow rapporteur on the opinion of the European Strategy for Critical Raw Materials, but also very much linked with the opinion for the proposal for regulation as well concerning batteries and waste batteries. So Ms. Ripa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ilyas, and thank you very much for inviting me today to speak at this event. And I already heard a very interesting discussion. I'm representing a party that will celebrate next year its 40th birthday. So it was founded when the sustainable idea was jumping into the political system. From the very beginning, this party believed in the principle of circularity, especially the 3R strategy, namely reduce, reuse, and recycle, was one of the cornerstones of any political program. Sometimes this 3R strategy is known as a 4 or even 5R strategy, adding other processes to this fundamental idea. I have to say, today I'm extremely pleased that circularity has become one of the most important factors of the European Green Deal. If we really want to end the so-called Anthropocene, where the man-made impact on this globe is about reaching tipping points that induce irreversible processes, we have to talk about circularity. Possibly the next area could be called the Cyclocene, which would be a big step for humankind. If we want to go there, we need to make the circular economy an even bigger priority than it is today. But it is not easy, especially when it comes to reprioritizing certain processes and technologies. Decoupling our economic growth from fossil exploitation is an important step, and we are about to get there. But we might be forced to start yet another exploitation, the end of critical raw material. As a shadow rapporteur in ITRE on recycling of batteries, I had a closer look to this technology. The problem is that huge battery demand will lead to an enormous consumption of some raw materials like cobalt, lithium, or graphite. Upscaling of the renewable infrastructure and the corresponding power grid will be based on big volumes of copper. And here's the problem. These raw materials are absolutely limited. On top of it, some of them are based on mining in nature-protected areas, which for me is an absolute no-go, like for Stefan, as this would just be a vicious circle, destroying nature, even if, with regard to the climate and biodiversity crisis, we have to protect it. Also, the production of batteries, which needs a lot of water in water-protected areas, like it is the case in Brandenburg, Germany at the moment, cannot be accepted. With regard to raw material extraction globally, but also within the EU, environmental sensitive areas must be protected. When it comes to raw material extraction in the EU, we must focus on our urban mines. For example, the old laptops and cell phones that lie unused in our households. We need to ensure a true cradle-to-cradle strategy. We cannot afford to have waste anymore. There is no point in tearing up some patches of the earth if we do not finally start thinking in terms of a sustainable circular economy. One last point on the extraction of raw materials. We need due diligence within the entire value chain. We need stronger environmental protection on global mining practices. With regard to trade, sustainability requirements should be a precondition to trade and investment in those materials in order to halt the serious impacts that accompany the extraction of raw materials, such as human rights abuses, environmental pollution, and biodiversity loss. Stefan mentioned it. We need to be consistent and not blind. I would say we need to see the holistic picture. Let me come shortly to recycling targets. I greatly welcome the higher recycling targets set by the Commission, but we need to pay attention to more nuances in this regard. Overall, we need to make sure that recyclates and new compounds made from those recyclates are usable and maximally degradable. Moreover, we need a well-functioning collection system in order to have enough products to recycle. Ulrich mentioned that already. But regarding waste, recycling isn't the first answer. It should be the last resort. So here I would go further than Paul did. What we need is a waste prevention or reuse. Waste target should reflect the waste hierarchy, starting by rethinking the design of a product to make it durable, repairable, and upgradable. At the moment, EU legislation has binding targets for recycling rather than for prevention and preparation for reuse. Although increasing recycling is positive, it is the last step to recover waste, and this should be reflected in EU legislation. Therefore, EU legislation must include the banning of planned obsolescence, adopting eco-design standards, increase durability, reusability, and repairability of products, including the right to repair, and the need for a non-toxic material cycles. But let's go back to the processes as such. The International Energy Agency just released a study that material demand for clean energy transition will increase substantially. It was mentioned already at the beginning. If we have a look at these figures that have been presented, we will discover that we need to take this seriously. The Sustainable Development Scenario already would quadruple the demand of critical materials, whereas the net zero scenario by 2040 would add a factor of 6. This would be the scenario if we do not have a significant further technology improvements and if we replace everything one-to-one. For example, all the combustion cars with electric vehicles, which we definitely should not do. But what's the way out? Is there a way out? My answer is a dedicated yes. We need definitely to limit the use of non-circular products to an absolute minimum. It is critical to keep the materials in the loop. The EU should become a leader in recycling and seize the current opportunity to become a worldwide pioneer in creating and legally granting a sustainable circular economy. And here material efficiency can contribute to reduce CO2 emissions through a combination of technology shifts and of material efficiency strategies. For example, reduce material losses during manufacturing and construction, lifetime extension, more intensive use, reuse and recycle. To conclude, I'm very happy that different stakeholders from politics, industry, civil society and NGOs are working on solutions and paving the way towards a circular economy. Nonetheless, we need to speed things up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Manuela Ripa, for your intervention. As mentioned by my colleague Regine in the chat, I would like to let the attendees of today's event once again know that this is the high time to send us your questions to our excellent set of speakers for the day. On this note, as it was voiced by nearly all speakers of today's event, it is unfortunate that the European Commission is not participating to the discussion today. But of course, on behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, we will communicate the discussion points across. So we will keep you posted with regards to any possible reactions. On this note, I would like to step on the comments made by Ms. Manuela Ripa and just ask a follow-up question to Stefan on the extraction of raw materials, and specifically, Stefan, what do you think about how can the EU ensure that the extraction of raw materials causes no environmental harm and contributes to social development?
Well, thank you, Elias. I'd like to have a clear and straight answer to this very difficult one, because I think the first thing we have to set is really always questioning, do we really need new mining? Do we really need new extraction? And I'm saying this without being naive. with regard the need for those critical raw material for green or digital technology. But I think, as been mentioned by Manuela, we have to ask ourselves, just giving an example, if we replace every single car operated with fossil fuel with an electric car, we just can't make it. But if we substitute one electric car to 5 fossil fuel operated car, because we've developed other type of mobility, then suddenly the recycling possibility of some of the critical raw material in batteries, such as cobalt, nickel, lithium, can really represent a significant amount of what we need to produce this only 1 out of 5 electric car. And I think this is really the first question. And according to me, we say it, a lot of people say it, but if we look the investment made, each time there is a new mining opportunity, in fact, we go for that and we invest. And being in Portugal, being in Sweden, being in country where we've got lithium, we have this investment. And I'd like to say, okay, can we in a way subordinate this investment to the evidence that more investment have been made in challenging the need, preventing, the need for new material, maximizing the recycling potential. And then when we have made sure that in a way we've aligned our investment strategy with those clear priorities, see, yeah, maybe then we are blocked and we need new mining. But I think honestly, we've walked on our heads so far. We've just said there is a new mining opportunity in Europe. It will reduce our dependency. We invest in there, and we haven't the equivalent investment and clear, I would say, action toward the more fundamental and systemic solution. Now, if you ask me, if we have to mine, what can be, I would say, some condition to make sure that this mining is made responsibly and is I think really we've got some form of very high standard. And to my understanding, I'm not an expert in mining standard, but the European Commission push as part of the raw material initiative as kind of stuck to the bare minimum. There is much higher standard which should be considered to ensure that in case we have to mine, then the higher standard are applied. And I just take that as an opportunity to also ask a question or to all panelists and MEP about, what could be a fair trade and free trade. Because, for example, it is very obvious that we try to keep, raw material as low as possible in terms of prices when processed material, processed product that we manufacture in Europe, we keep high price. And it's not obvious to me that, for example, we unleash the potential in mining countries so that they can develop the intermediary steps. And we've got clear example of, for example, how the Europe play a kind of dirty game, with World Trade Organization in Indonesia when they say, well, you should not block export of your nickel because we need nickel. And on the other side, when they deal with Chile, they also make some difficulty for Chile to invest in lithium refining and lithium enriching, or because they prefer to keep that here. So I think it's also beyond, I would say, only the mining of material. It's also the whole system, the whole value chain that we need to question in terms of how that can impact our trade policy, and how our trade policy can also be aligned with this kind of responsible consumption and, if need be, mining. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. And is there perhaps any other speaker, any other panelist that would like to step in for a comment? Yes, Emmanuel, I see you raise your hand.
Yes, actually, I have comment on 3 points. One on packaging that has been very much discussed, one on critical raw materials, and one on free trade. So on packaging, right now I'm sitting in a hotel in front of the Adriatic Sea because there is a big fair for environmental industries called the Commando at Rimini. And we are going here, among many things, to discuss and advertise a project on multi-layer plastic films recycling. And it has been said, you have multi-layer films are used in basically different types of application, including flexible packaging. And like Holy Grail, which is a project we are working now on developing technologies to recycle multi-layer films, multi-layer plastic films from packaging and agriculture. And we work with the entire value chain. And I think one thing that is absolutely crucial when we want to define recyclability, in a laboratory, everything is recyclable. What matters is to make sure that they are being recycled actually based on the system and the technology which is available at the time packaging products are placed on the market, because the lifetime of packaging products is rather short. And this is why I very much strongly support to actually not only look at the recyclability itself, but the actual recyclability. And this is where the essential requirements that are going to be set in the upcoming Packaging and Packaging Waste Directive are essential. And obviously, at the same time, look at whether those materials that are recyclables are actually used in new products. And here, especially for packaging, where we need high standards, there is a kind of challenge for the entire value chain to make sure we have proper collection, proper recycling, and proper use, and everything goes together. Very clear example, PET. PET is a hard polymer, it has been said. With recycled content, for the first time, there was a complete decorrelation between oil prices and recycled PET prices. And when oil prices collapsed at the beginning of the COVID crisis, 1.5 years ago, all polymer prices, whether virgin or recycled, collapsed. Huge problem for the recycling industry because we couldn't be competitive. Our cost structure is different than oil producers. And here, the only polymer type that didn't actually face that challenge was PET. And so it showed that here recycled content played a key role in not stopping investment to basically meet a demand that was set by legislation. So point number 2 about, for instance, what has been said on reuse and recycling. And I want to make the case here with batteries, and we find a lot of critical raw materials in batteries. I think here the approach of the Commission and the work the Commission is doing to even have a higher degree of ambition is extremely important, because for the first time we have a regulation that has a value chain approach and a lot of requirements, for instance, to make sure that batteries are easier to dismantle. I'm not even speaking here about the recycling technology, are important both for repair, reuse, actually reuse here, and recycling, because during the use phase that will make things easier to basically extract and reuse. And during the recycling phase, the dismantling is absolutely essential to make sure that the different types of batteries are going to go through the right channel for proper recycling. So I think here a number of requirements linked to design, not all, but a number of them will actually be beneficial both to the reuse and to the recycling. Last but not least, on exports, I think there is no doubt that as a recycling industry, we do not want mixed municipal solid waste or unprocessed TLV or processed e-waste to be exported. But the fractions, the raw materials that are still classified as a waste, unfortunately, and this is why we need also to be much better in making distinction between what is a raw materials from recycling and what is an unprocessed waste, need to have access to international markets. Not all raw materials are critical, and at the same time, the demand in Europe cannot always meet the supply from the recycling industry. If we are putting export restrictions, that will have very large impacts in terms of growth creation and consolidation in the recycling industry. And I think this is not actually to say we need to ship all our waste outside Europe, but we need to make sure that the raw materials from recycling that are meeting quality specification do have access to international markets. Otherwise, the economics of the market, which is a commodity market, will collapse and we have a great problem in recycling in Europe.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel. Is there perhaps any other speaker that would like to step in?
Please,
looking at Paul, yes. Or Ulrich, perhaps? Yes, Paul, the floor is yours.
Just briefly, I mean, I liked, so Manuela was right. She picked me up on focusing on recycle and brought in reuse and refill, and I think that's correct. But there needs to be some surety, some certainty about the role of recycling in the future. because the investments that are needed still in recycling are enormous in whatever part of the system you look at, sorting, collection, recycling. And they need to pay off over, decades probably. And it worries me slightly that there's a big shift towards reuse and refill as if they replace recycled entirely. And I don't think that's correct. I don't think it's necessarily the right way to go. So I do think some thinking around that and the relative balance of the different strategies we can pursue would be very, very useful. So we look at refill, we look at reuse. I see one of the questions was, if we didn't have packaging for soft drinks, then we'd avoid a whole ton of transport for sure. If we could have a tap just delivering PepsiCo or Alvale into your home, we'd love it. But at the end of the day, consumers were set up in a certain way. Consumers are set up in a certain way where packaging is needed, and it will continue to be needed for the foreseeable future. And then I think we need that packaging to be recycled. So we work towards that. At the same time, we look at SodaStream we have and so on, which is reuse and refill. So I think there's a balance there that needs to be achieved. Even within the recycled space, I think there are unlocks there that are badly needed. So we mentioned RPET as being, and Emmanuel has just mentioned it again, as being one of the success stories. It is and it isn't. And at the moment we face a really serious problem in the sense that we've responded to the Commission's stimulus to take 10 million tons out of plastic by 2025. Circular Plastics Alliance, we're part of that, so is Food Drink Europe. But in fact, for us to get our hands on RPET, it's very difficult at the moment because the certification process to authorize recyclers to say this particular plastic that you're buying has been recycled, that process is held up with bottlenecks in the Commission and EFSA. If those bottlenecks, we understand they will be solved, but if they're not solved quickly, it puts in jeopardy our promises to go towards RPET in all those markets in the future. So that's one. The second, I think, is we need much more collection across Europe of other slightly more difficult to recycle packaging. And at the moment, that's not done. As I mentioned earlier, in most countries in Europe, most of the other packaging is just put into the general waste bin, and that then just gets incinerated and landfilled. And in that regard, I think there needs to be economically, we need to tilt away from landfill and incineration more towards recyclability. And there, I think there are, some of the fees that are charged, some of the ways in which landfill and incineration is easier, less costly, I think needs to be addressed. And I'll stop there. There's a whole ton of other things I'd like to say, but I think that would be enough.
Thank you very much, Paul. Any other speaker that would like to take the floor? Otherwise, I'm happy to take a couple of questions from the audience. All right. Well, seeing no reaction, I will just take a couple of questions from our Q&A's box. So the first one would be, thank you very much to all speakers for their contributions. I would be further interested in hearing more about how due diligence can support greening raw materials policy in Europe. Is there any speaker that would like to take the floor? I can repeat the question. That would be in hearing more about how due diligence can support greening raw materials policy in Europe. This is, of course, an open question to all panelists. Perhaps we can start with Stefan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, for me, it's quite straightforward. I mean, as long as we stay blind on the extraction and mining practices, then there is no way we can improve them. So that means that requiring a systematic due diligence up to the extraction process, being biotic resources or abiotic resources, I mean mineral resources or biomass-based resources, is a fundamental point. First, to know how we can improve, and then to, of course, trigger action. So no due diligence means no improvement potential. Will be a very straightforward answer.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Ripa, I know that you have to leave very soon.
Yes, unfortunately. And regarding due diligence, what we can do, A very short answer, very concrete. We also need not only less mining, as Stefan said, but we also need a political will. And here, this is not always easy. I mean, you mentioned it. I was a shadow rapporteur in ITRE regarding batteries. There, we wanted to have the battery production, the due diligence on battery production throughout the entire value chain. With my colleagues, it was only possible to extend it to the supply chain. So here we have to look at industry, what they're telling their politicians, what is right or not. So I definitely am missing also the political will. And I mean, Mrs. Sorry for the name, Asimakopoulou, she was also ITRE shadow rapporteur, shadow rapporteur with me on raw materials. And we had a lot of discussions of how to better have raw materials trade and restrictions and everything. So, I mean, often there are really different views on things, and it's very, very difficult to have changes within the parliament. So you can imagine how difficult that is outside the parliament. So I'm missing often very much the political will in a lot of things.
Thank you very much, Ms. Ripa, for your reply. And Ulrich, I think you also wanted to intervene to this question on due diligence.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Due diligence is a system that works, that is needed. We have in our sector we have a long experience with it. We have the EU timber regulation that has basically two components. One is the prohibition to put any illegally logged timber on the market. The other component is to have a due diligence system in place that makes sure that you know where you are sourcing from, and that the sourcing of that timber is in accordance with the EU timber regulation. The Commission is expected to put forward a proposal on deforestation or against deforestation in the coming weeks, and so also there due diligence is a cornerstone of the system. It is very important that the long experiences that we have with forest certification is acknowledged there, so that companies do not have to have different systems in place when it comes to proving it comes from deforestation, where it comes from illegal logging, where it comes from. So it needs to be clear that these due diligence systems encompass functioning systems that are already in place. But we are of course very supportive of having measures in place that the products from companies that are having a sustainable sourcing policy in place are not getting unfair competition from outside Europe, where deforestation, unfortunately, is still the case, which is leading to climate change.
Thank you very much, Ulrich. Another question for our panelists today, coming from the audience, would be that what about the waste shipment regulation? And specifically, do you think that banning exports could help keep resources in the EU, but also reducing the harmful impacts in other countries, especially when exporting difficult or toxic waste and products, often without EPR following? Perhaps Stefan would like to take the floor. Emmanuel as well. Perhaps we can start with Emmanuel.
Yeah, I can start. As I said, when it comes to complex products, unprocessed products, for instance, end-of-life vehicles or e-waste or whole tires, it goes without saying that they should not be exported or be only exported to places where we know that proper treatment is going to take place. And for instance, we are looking forward to the revision of the end-of-life vehicles directive, where it's already forbidden to export end-of-life vehicles but there are a lot of loopholes because basically they are being exported as used cars. And we've made a very practical proposal. We say to distinguish between a used car that can be exported anywhere and outside Europe too, versus an end-of-life vehicle. Here, you need to do a roadworthiness test, and if the car is roadworthy, then it's a used car, no export restriction. If it's not, it shall not be exported unless properly repaired and pass again the test. That's very practical. The same would apply to actually e-waste. I've been with the Commission visiting sites in Africa where you can see that the treatment standards are absolutely not met. And here you have extremely artisanal ways of recovering, which is extremely helpful first for the people who are carrying on these operations, only to recover the very valuable materials, while the rest are being burned in open air, and the same happens with tires. But those export restrictions shall only target those problematic waste streams, not the processed materials, where we are not speaking here about very low value per se waste, but high value raw materials that can be used directly by smelters, steel mills, paper mills to produce actually new metals or paper. And here we need to have a free and fair market. That's absolutely essential to make sure that as an industry can strive to be competitive. So I think that that's really why we are calling to make sure that while we are trying to tackle extremely important problems through the waste shipment regulation, we are preventing ourselves from actually unintended consequences that will have a very big impact on the recycling industry. So that's what I wanted to say, because on preventing toxic waste from leaving Europe, I think there should be absolutely no discussion. Yes, that's a must.
Thank you very much. And Stefan, perhaps very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. We've got an ongoing discussion with Emmanuel and anyway about being much more demanding for waste shipment regulation. We think the waste shipment regulation, to make it very short, is also an opportunity for you to become exporter of secondary raw material rather than waste. And we, being exporter of secondary raw material, we create jobs in you, and we ensure that the quality material are circulated, and if they come back in new manufactured product, at least they are safe and they are toxic free, or at least compliant with your regulation. I'd like to insist on something Emmanuel rightly mentioned. There is a distinction between shipment for reuse and shipment of waste, and Emmanuel is very clear that sometimes shipment for reuse has been used as a loophole, to ship waste. But I want to stress the fact that even if we ship for reuse, at the moment, we cannot ensure that the bad practice that Emmanuel highlighting will not happen. If I ship a mobile phone for reuse, it's perfectly authorized because it's a product, but I cannot ensure that the waste management will be done properly in those countries. If I ship to another country the car that will be banned in Europe because they are over-consuming, do I really help the decarbonization, knowing that climate change is for the whole planet, not only for you? So I think there is now an opportunity with the waste shipment regulation also to say, as consumer, we pay what we call extended producer responsibility fees for a proper waste management. This waste management can happen in Europe or elsewhere, but those fees should be used to ensure a proper waste management. At the moment, when you ship a reused phone or a reused battery or a reused car or a reused whatever which is covered by producer responsibility, basically the fees are not following the product. So we delegate the duty of waste management to the receiving country of these reuse items without providing the financial means that we need in Europe to make a proper collection and recycling. This is totally unfair, and that's why I invite the European Parliament to think about that. It's unfair because as consumer, we are paying those fees and they are not used for what they've been paid for. And it's unfair because we are delegating, the duty of waste management to this receiving country in condition that we will not accept for ourselves in Europe. And I think there is an opportunity with the waste shipment regulation to also address this kind of shipment for reuse, which are not waste, it's true, which will be growing, because as we go for more repairable, longer lasting product, we will intensify the shipment for reuse. And if this loophole is not sorted, at the end of the day, we will create more pollution because the wastage will not be properly done in those receiving countries. I think it is extremely important that people, and notably the European Parliament, help us to make the case on this and correct the situation, which is totally unfair today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and thanks a lot to all of our excellent speakers of today's event. On behalf of the Secretariat of the European Parliament Intergroup, I would like to thank you all. And of course, a warm thanks goes out also to all attendees, all viewers of this webinar, for their active engagement with regards to addressing greening raw materials policy. So on this note, I would like to thank you very much for your contributions and provide the floor back to hosting MEP, Ms. Asimakopoulou, for wrapping up today's event, for her key takeaway messages and closing remarks of today's webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Elias. It's been really a pleasure to follow this interesting discussion. I'll just make a few points, and I'll start with where we started, which was Emmanuel. So, you know, I of all the wonderful things that you've said today and all the interesting things I've heard about what we can do on product design, on setting targets, being more ambitious on that, on the balance we need when we price the carbon, which I agree with completely, on what you see as regulatory necessities with respect to the internal market. I think my key takeaway from all of your interventions will be the need for foreseeability. I think that that this is what I would highlight. I mean, this is an across the board, let's say, ask that I think is very important for industry, and I think that it's well addressed as a key point here. Now, Stefan, again, I'm very pleased to address planet boundaries. I'm very pleased to be brave when that's necessary. Certainly no one wants to turn a blind eye. I think from Stefan's intervention, I'll focus on the word responsible. I think that's something that we all can rally around in order to address the challenges that brings, whether that has to do with mining or explaining to local communities, or whether that has to do with any of the policies that we implement. Coming to Gilrich's intervention, I think it's when we hear from what is clearly a champion in this in achieving these objectives, I think we need to be very vigilant in listening to what's required. I'm not the Commission, so I certainly can't address the definition of secondary raw materials. Perhaps if we had a representative here, that could be an interesting discussion for you. But I do hear what you're saying, and it's interesting for me politically also to support. And what I'll focus on and what you have indicated are the bottlenecks that we need to address. When a champion who has actually reached these objectives talks about bottlenecks, we need to open our ears as policymakers and listen. And I come to Paul, and you know, obviously, Paul, the scale and the scope of the industry you represent makes you an important voice to listen to, but also an important factor that can help us reach our objectives. You know, yes, the objective is clearly to move to recycled from recyclable, but you know, you're going to keep getting pressured on the recyclable aspect of it. And what I'll keep from yours is that I think that it's very interesting for us to work together to harmonize instructions from consumers, because that's something that that we can all work on, and that I think will go a long way. And in closing, and it's been very interesting to hear from my colleagues, of course, in the Parliament as well, the honourable members, Mr. Enger and Ms. Riba. I think that it's fair to say that though we may have different perspectives and different political priorities, we all have the same high level of ambition. We share common goals. And in the end, I think what brings us together is the same sense of urgency that we need to find solutions. So with these positive points, I would like to thank you again, Elias, for putting together this excellent event, which I think that brings us closer together on reaching solutions. And puts aside things that might at times seem to keep us apart. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Asimakopoulou, for kindly hosting today's event, also for wrapping up today's discussions. So as we've reached the end of today's webinar, I'm very much looking forward to continuing the debate in the future ahead. Honestly, it feels like we could continue the discussions for many more hours. So very much looking forward to more opportunities in the near future. So until then, thank you very much to Ms. Asimakopoulou for kindly hosting, to our excellent set of speakers, and of course, a warm thanks to our audience as well for following today's discussions. Until then, until next time, all the best and stay safe. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.